In the heart of St. Michael's Parish, nestled among the ancient oaks and weathered tombstones of Silver Valley, stood a modest stone church where Father Thomas Riley tended to his flock with unwavering dedication. The gentle sound of hymns and quiet prayers filled the sacred space each morning, a stark contrast to the thunderous echoes of gunfire that had once defined his life. None of his parishioners could have guessed that their soft-spoken priest, who spent his days counseling troubled souls and feeding the homeless, had once been the most lethal sharpshooter in the Marine Corps' history. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colourful patterns across the worn wooden pews as Father Thomas prepared for his daily routine. His movements were measured and precise, a habit ingrained from years of military discipline that he had never quite shaken. The church bells tolled 6 times, their deep resonance carrying across the sleepy town of Silver Valley, calling the faithful to morning mass. Father Thomas adjusted his collar, his weathered hands moving with the same steadiness that had once allowed him to hit targets from impossible distances. At 55, his face carried the gentle lines of wisdom and compassion, but his steel-grey eyes remained sharp and alert, constantly scanning his surroundings. Another habit he couldn't break. The morning light caught the silver in his closely cropped hair, a reminder of the years that had passed since he'd traded his rifle for a rosary. The church had become his sanctuary, not just spiritually, but literally. After 20 years of service, after seeing humanity at its worst, Father Thomas had found peace in serving God and his community. The small parish wasn't much by worldly standards. The paint was peeling in places, the garden needed constant attention, and the roof leaked during heavy rains. But to him, it was paradise compared to the war-torn landscapes he had left behind. His congregation was small but devoted, mostly consisting of elderly residents who had lived in Silver Valley their entire lives, young families seeking guidance, and a handful of veterans who found solace in his sermons. They knew him as the patient priest who never turned anyone away, who spent hours listening to their troubles and offering wisdom tempered with kindness. They saw his calm demeanor, his steady hands during communion, his unwavering attention when they spoke, but they didn't see the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when a car backfired, or when the 4th of July celebrations brought too many memories rushing back. As he arranged the altar for morning mass, Sister Margaret bustled in, her practical shoes clicking against the stone floor. At 72, she had been with the parish longer than anyone could remember, and she ran the church's daily operations with military precision that would have impressed Father Thomas's former commanding officers. "Good morning, Father," she called out, already moving to straighten the flower arrangements. "The Thompson family called. Their youngest is sick, and they won't make it to Mass today. Oh, and those motorcycles are back again, racing up and down Main Street at all hours. Someone ought to do something about that." Father Thomas nodded, acknowledging her concerns while his mind registered the underlying tension in her voice. The motorcycles had been a growing presence in Silver Valley over the past few weeks, their riders showing little regard for the peace of the small town. He had seen them from his window above the church, leather-clad figures who seemed to take pleasure in disrupting the quiet community with their loud engines and aggressive behavior. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, sister," he replied, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had become his trademark. "Perhaps they're searching for something they don't even know they're missing." Sister Margaret made a sound that might have been either agreement or skepticism, but she knew better than to argue with Father Thomas's perpetual optimism. She had never seen him lose his temper, never heard him raise his voice, even when faced with the most trying circumstances. There was something about his calmness that seemed to affect everyone around him, like still waters running deep. The morning progressed as it always did, with Father Thomas leading Mass for the handful of early risers who attended daily services. His homily focused on forgiveness and understanding, themes that had become increasingly important to him over the years. As he spoke, his eyes swept over his congregation, taking in Mrs. Henderson in her usual spot near the front, the Rodriguez family with their squirming toddler, and old Mr. Peterson, a fellow veteran who always sat in the back pew. After Mass, Father Thomas made his way to the small office adjacent to the church. The room was spartanly furnished, a simple desk, a few chairs, and a wall of books ranging from religious texts to historical volumes. The only personal touch was a small silver cross on his desk, a gift from his unit when he'd left the service to enter the seminary. He never spoke about its significance, just as he never spoke about the medals locked away in a box in his quarters. The morning sun had grown stronger, and through his window he could see the church's small garden where he spent many hours tending to the vegetables that helped supply the local food bank. The garden had become his meditation space, a place where he could work with his hands and find peace in the simple act of nurturing life. It was as far removed from his former life as he could imagine, and that was exactly why he valued it so much. As he settled into his chair to review the day's appointments, a distant rumble of motorcycles caught his attention. The sound was different from the usual passing bikes. This was multiple engines moving slowly, deliberately. Father Thomas's body tensed instinctively, old instincts coming alive, even as his expression remained serene. He knew that sound, the sound of predators marking their territory. Sister Margaret appeared in his doorway, her usual composed demeanor showing signs of worry. "Father, there are some individuals who wish to speak with you. They're rather insistent." Her hesitation told him everything he needed to know about their visitors. "Thank you, sister. Please show them in." His voice remained calm, but his mind was already calculating angles, distances, potential threats. An automatic assessment that had saved his life countless times in another life. As Sister Margaret left, he stood and moved to the window, positioning himself where he could see the approaching visitors while appearing casual. 3 men entered his office, their leather vests adorned with patches that marked them as members of a motorcycle club. The leader, a tall man with a graying beard and hard eyes, stepped forward while his companions remained near the door. Father Thomas recognized the positioning: 1 to lead, 2 to control the exit. Some things never changed, whether in war, zones, or small-town parishes. "Welcome to St. Michael's," Father Thomas said, turning to face them with a gentle smile. "How can I help you today?" The leader's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, but held no warmth. "Name's Marcus. We're new in town, Father, and we're looking to establish some community relationships." His voice carried a subtle threat beneath the casual words. Father Thomas gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit. Would you like some coffee? Sister Margaret makes an excellent brew." His offer seemed to throw them off balance. They had clearly expected a different reaction to their intimidating presence. Marcus remained standing, his posture rigid. "We'll keep this short, Father. Silver Valley is changing. New management, you might say. We're offering protection to local establishments, including this fine church of yours. Small weekly donation, and you won't have to worry about any unfortunate accidents." Father Thomas's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his eyes, a barely perceptible change that Marcus missed entirely. 20 years ago, that same look had preceded some of the most precise shots ever recorded in Marine Corps history. "That's very thoughtful of you," Father Thomas replied, his voice still carrying its usual warmth. "But St. Michael's has managed quite well for over 100 years without such arrangements. We trust in a higher authority for our protection." Marcus's face darkened. "Maybe you're not understanding me, Father. Bad things happen to good people all the time. Would be a shame if something happened to this beautiful old church, or to some of your more vulnerable parishioners." Father Thomas stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. To anyone who knew what to look for, there was something almost predatory in his grace, but his voice remained gentle. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Marcus, and I think you should understand something as well." He moved around his desk, each step measured. "This church is a sanctuary for many people. It's a place of peace, of healing, of hope. I've dedicated my life to maintaining that peace." For a moment, just a fraction of a second, Father Thomas's calm facade slipped, and Marcus caught a glimpse of something in the priest's eyes that made him take an involuntary step back. It was gone so quickly he might have imagined it, but there was something in the way the priest moved, something in his stance that suddenly seemed less like a man of God and more like something else entirely. "We all have choices to make," Father Thomas continued, his voice still soft, but carrying an undertone that hadn't been there before. "I chose this life of service after seeing too much of what humans are capable of doing to each other. I pray every day for the strength to maintain that choice." He paused, his grey eyes locked on Marcus's. "I suggest you choose wisely about your next actions regarding this church and its people." Marcus attempted to recover his bravado, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. His two companions seemed to sense it too, shifting uneasily. Near the door, "Are you threatening us, Father?" Father Thomas smiled, and it was a kind smile, a genuine one, which somehow made it all the more unsettling. "No, Mr. Marcus. I'm simply having a conversation about choices and consequences. Something I discuss with my parishioners quite often." He moved to open the office door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a funeral to prepare for. God go with you." The dismissal was clear, and though Marcus's face flushed with anger, he found himself moving toward the door, almost against his will. As the three men left, their boots heavy on the stone floor, Father Thomas watched them go, his expression thoughtful. Once they were gone, he closed the door quietly and returned to his desk, where he sat for a long moment in silence. Finally, he reached for his drawer and pulled out a worn, leather-bound Bible. Opening it carefully, he removed an old photograph tucked between its pages. The image showed a younger version of himself in desert camouflage, a Barrett M82 sniper rifle resting across his legs, surrounded by his unit. His fingers traced the edges of the photo briefly before he returned it to its hiding place. The rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance as Father Thomas bowed his head in prayer, asking for guidance, for peace, and for the strength to keep his past where it belonged. But even as he prayed, another part of his mind, the part that had never truly left the battlefield, began preparing for what he knew was coming. The wolves had marked their territory, and they wouldn't back down easily. Soon he would have to decide how far he was willing to go to protect his flock. The days that followed the biker's visit brought an uneasy calm to Silver Valley. Father Thomas maintained his regular routine, but there was a new awareness in his movements, a heightened vigilance that he hadn't needed to employ in years. He noticed the small changes in the town, the way people hurried through their errands, how the streets grew quiet earlier each evening, the nervous glances thrown toward the growing number of motorcycles parked outside the local bars. The morning air was crisp as Father Thomas tended to the church garden, his hands working methodically among the tomato plants. The familiar task helped ground him, though his senses remained alert to his surroundings. The sound of Sister Margaret's approaching footsteps made him look up from his work. "The Henderson family called," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Their store was vandalized last night. Windows broken, spray paint everywhere. The police say there's no evidence of who did it, but—" She left the implication hanging in the air. Father Thomas straightened slowly, wiping the dirt from his hands. The Hendersons had owned their small grocery store for 3 generations. Mrs. Henderson had been one of his most devoted parishioners since he'd arrived at St. Michael's. Were they hurt? No, thank the Lord. But they're frightened, Father. Everyone is. Sister Margaret's weathered face showed the strain of recent events. These men, they're not just passing through, are they? No, sister, I don't believe they are. Father Thomas's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it that Sister Margaret had never heard before. Perhaps we should organize a community meeting. After Sunday's service, people need to know they're not alone. As he spoke, his eyes tracked the movement of a motorcycle passing slowly by the church, its rider making no attempt to hide his surveillance. The priest's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the garden tool he held, muscle memory from years of handling different kinds of equipment surfacing unbidden. Inside the church, Father Thomas found Mr. Peterson waiting in the last pew, his weathered hands clutching his veteran's cap. The old soldier had served in Vietnam, and there was a knowing look in his eyes as he watched Father Thomas approach. "Trouble's brewing, Father," Peterson said without preamble. "Reminds me of how things started in my old neighborhood before. It all went to hell. These fellas, they're organized, professional, not just some rowdy bikers passing through." Father Thomas sat beside him, maintaining the composed demeanor his parishioners had come to rely on. "What have you noticed, James?" "They're mapping the town, establishing patterns." "I've seen it before." Peterson's voice dropped lower. "But there's something else. Something about you has them puzzled. The way you handled them the other day. Word gets around in a small town." Father Thomas remained silent, letting the old veteran speak. Peterson had always been perceptive. It was one of the reasons he'd survived Vietnam when many others hadn't. "You're not just any priest, are you, Father?" Peterson's eyes held a knowing look. "The way you move, the way you observe. I've seen that before too. In men who've seen things, done things. The morning light, streaming through the stained glass windows, cast colored shadows across their faces as Father Thomas considered his response. "We all have our past, James. What matters is the choices we make now." Peterson nodded slowly. "Some choices find us, Father, whether we want them to or not." He stood, placing his cap back on his head. "Just want you to know, whatever comes, you've got support. More than you might think." As Peterson's footsteps echoed away, Father Thomas remained in the pew, his mind drifting to memories he'd worked hard to leave behind. The weight of his past pressed against his consciousness, the countless hours spent in position, the perfect stillness required for the perfect shot, the lives he'd taken in service of what he'd believed was right. The sound of motorcycles drew closer again. Multiple engines this time. Father Thomas rose and moved to the church door, his steps silent despite his heavy work boots. Through the old wood, he could hear voices, loud and confrontational, in the church parking lot. Opening the door, he found 3 bikers surrounding. A young woman who had been arranging flowers by the church steps. Sarah Chen volunteered at the church twice a week, maintaining the small gardens that brightened the entrance. Now she stood frozen, clutching her gardening shears, as the men circled her. "Gentlemen," Father Thomas called out, his voice carrying an authority that made them all turn. "Is there something I can help you with?" The bikers exchanged glances, and Father Thomas recognized one of them from Marcus's visit. Sarah took the opportunity to slip past them, hurrying to Father Thomas's side. He could feel her trembling. "Just admiring the gardens, Father," one of them sneered. "Shame if anything happened to them, or to the pretty little gardener." Father Thomas placed himself between Sarah and the bikers, his movement subtle but definitive. "Sarah, please go inside and help Sister Margaret with the altar preparation." His tone left no room for argument, and Sarah quickly disappeared into the church. Once she was gone, something in Father Thomas's posture shifted. It was barely perceptible, but the bikers sensed it. The priest before them suddenly seemed taller, more solid, his presence filling the space between them in a way that made them instinctively step back. "I believe we've already discussed the matter of threats to this church and its people," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone that hadn't been there before. "I would hate for there to be any misunderstanding about my position on that subject." The lead biker tried to maintain his aggressive stance, but something in Father Thomas's steady gaze made him uncomfortable. It was like being watched through a scope, though he couldn't have explained why that image came to mind. "Just passing through, Father," he muttered finally, signaling to his companions. They mounted their bikes, but before riding away he turned back. "Marcus sends his regards, says to remind you that time's running out to make the right choice." Father Thomas watched them leave, his expression unchanged, but his mind racing through calculations and scenarios he hadn't considered in years. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had confirmed what he'd suspected. The situation was escalating, and peaceful resolution was becoming less likely with each passing day. Inside the church, he found Sarah sitting with Sister Margaret, still shaken, but trying to compose herself. "I'm so sorry, Father," she said as he approached. "I should have been more careful, should have gone inside when I heard them coming." "You have nothing to apologize for, Sarah," he assured her, his voice gentle once again. "But perhaps it would be better if you did your gardening earlier in the morning for now, and not alone." Sister Margaret's expression was troubled as she watched. Father Thomas moved toward his office. She had known him for 5 years, since he'd first arrived at St. Michael's, and she had never seen him quite like this. There was something in his bearing that reminded her of her brother when he'd returned from Desert Storm, a coiled readiness beneath a calm exterior. In his office, Father Thomas closed the door and moved to the window, his eyes scanning the street beyond with professional assessment. The bikers had left, but he knew they would be back. They were testing boundaries, pushing to see where the breaking points were. It was a tactical approach he recognized all too well. He opened his desk drawer and removed a small key, then walked to the cabinet in the corner of his office. Inside, behind a stack of old hymnals, was a small safe. He hadn't opened it in years, had hoped he would never need to, but as his fingers traced the combination lock, muscle memory took over. The safe contained only 2 items, a worn leather case and a simple silver medallion. The medallion had been given to him by his spotter, Jake Martinez, just before Jake had taken a bullet meant for him in Fallujah. The leather case contained something else entirely, something he had sworn to leave behind when he'd taken his vows. Father Thomas closed the safe without removing either item, but simply knowing they were there brought both comfort and conflict. He returned to his desk and opened his Bible, seeking guidance in the familiar words. His eyes fell on Ecclesiastes. "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time for war, and a time for peace." Knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. It was Mrs. Henderson, her eyes red from crying, her usually neat appearance disheveled. "Father, I didn't know where else to go. They came back to the store. They said they would hurt Tommy if we didn't pay them. My grandson, Father, he's only 12. Father Thomas felt something shift inside him, a familiar coldness he hadn't experienced in years. Threatening children crossed a line that even in his darkest days as a sniper he had never approached. He listened as Mrs. Henderson poured out her fear and anger, his expression compassionate, while his mind began forming plans he had hoped never to need again. "Trust in the Lord, Mrs. Henderson," he said when she had finished, his voice steady and reassuring, "and trust that he works through all of us to protect his children." He didn't tell her that sometimes the Lord's work required skills learned. In places far from any church, as the sun set over Silver Valley that evening, Father Thomas stood in the church tower, ostensibly checking on some minor repairs. His trained eye surveyed the town spread out below him, noting lines of sight, potential cover, escape routes, all the things he had once calculated for very different purposes. The town was changing, and with it, the man who had thought he'd left certain skills behind forever. In the gathering darkness, he offered a prayer, not just for guidance or strength, but for forgiveness for what he might be called upon to do. The weight of his past pressed against him, not as a burden now, but as a tool he might need to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The distant rumble of motorcycles echoed through the valley, a sound that was becoming all too familiar. Father Thomas crossed himself and descended from the tower, each step measured and deliberate. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, and he would face it with both the grace of his calling and, if necessary, the skills of his past. The morning. Sunlight streamed through the church windows as Father Thomas prepared for early Mass, but his thoughts were far from his usual prayers and preparations. The night had brought more trouble to Silver Valley. The Rodriguez family's restaurant had been vandalized, its windows shattered and walls defaced with crude threats. It was the third such incident in a week, and the pattern was becoming clear. As he arranged the altar candles, his hands moving with practiced precision, Father Thomas noticed Mr. Peterson slipping quietly into the back pew. The old veteran was early, unusually so, and his presence at this hour spoke volumes. Their eyes met briefly across the empty church, a silent understanding passing between them. Sister Margaret's footsteps echoed through the nave, her usual brisk pace slowed by the weight of the news she carried. "Father, have you heard about the restaurant? Maria Rodriguez is beside herself. They're saying they can't afford to keep fixing the damage, but they can't afford to pay these men either." Father Thomas nodded slowly, his expression remaining serene despite the anger building within him. "How are the children taking it?" Little Anna had nightmares all night. Their bedroom window faces the street where Sister Margaret trailed off, her hands twisting in her apron. "Father, people are talking about leaving town. The Petersons, the Chens, even the Hendersons, families that have been here for generations." The priest's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the brass candlestick he held. "The Lord tests us in many ways, sister, but he never gives us more than we can bear." His voice was steady, but there was an undertone that made Sister Margaret study him more closely. As the morning progressed, more details of the previous night's events emerged. The bikers had grown bolder, their intimidation more overt. They had established a base at the old Miller warehouse on the edge of town, their numbers growing daily. The local police seemed helpless or unwilling to intervene. After morning Mass, Father Thomas found himself in his office, staring at the locked cabinet that held his past. The sound of approaching motorcycles drew his attention to the window. 3 bikes pulled into the church parking lot, their riders dismounting with deliberate swagger. Among them was Marcus himself, his leather vest adorned with new patches that proclaimed his authority. Before they could reach the church doors, Father Thomas stepped outside to meet them. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the pavement, his black cassock a stark contrast to the brightness of the day. "Father Thomas," Marcus called out, his voice carrying false joviality. "Beautiful morning for a chat about community relations, wouldn't you say?" "Indeed it is," Father Thomas replied calmly, "though I believe our last conversation was quite clear." Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Things change, Father. The situation in town is becoming unstable. Accidents happening, left and right. But we can help with that, for the right price, of course." Father Thomas remained still, but something in his posture shifted subtly. Years of training surfaced in the way he positioned himself, analyzing angles and distances automatically. "The only thing unstable in this town is the fear you're trying to create." Strong words from a man of God, Marcus sneered, stepping closer. But words won't fix broken windows or protect little kids from accidents. He gestured broadly at the church. Nice place you got here. Lots of old wood. Very flammable. The threat hung in the air between them. Father Thomas felt a familiar stillness settle over him, the kind of focus that had once allowed him to remain motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. Let me tell you a story, Marcus, he said, his voice taking on a quality that made the other men shift uneasily. Many years ago, I knew a man who believed that strength came from causing fear. He thought that breaking things and hurting people made him powerful. Father Thomas stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He was wrong. Marcus tried to maintain his intimidating stance, but something in the priest's eyes made him hesitate. Is this where you tell me Jesus will save my soul, Father? No, Father Thomas replied softly. This is where I tell you that man made the mistake of threatening children. He didn't live long enough to regret it. The words were delivered with the same gentle tone he used for sermons, but they carried a weight that made Marcus take an involuntary step back. For a moment, none of them moved. Then Marcus forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. Careful, Father. Sounds almost like a threat. Wouldn't want people thinking their priest isn't the holy man he pretends to be. Father Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not a threat, Marcus, just a lesson in history and perspective. He turned slightly, drawing their attention to the church tower rising behind him. Did you know that tower offers a view of the entire town? On a good day, you can see for miles. Every street, every building, every warehouse. The implication wasn't lost on Marcus. His face darkened as he studied the priest with new awareness. You're playing a dangerous game, old man. I stopped playing games a long time ago, Father Thomas responded quietly. When I chose this path, I made vows to protect my flock. I intend to honor those vows one way or another. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Mr. Peterson chose. That moment to emerge from the church, followed by 3 other men, Father Thomas recognized from his congregation. All veterans, all carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of men who had seen combat. Everything all right here, Father? Peterson asked, his tone casual, but his stance anything but. Marcus glanced between the gathering group and Father Thomas, reassessing the situation. Finally, he gestured to his companions. We'll continue this discussion later, Father. Give our regards to the Rodriguez family. As the bikers roared away, Peterson moved to stand beside Father Thomas. They'll be back, he said quietly. And next time they'll bring more men. I know, Father Thomas replied, his eyes tracking the departing motorcycles. Which is why we need to be prepared. He turned to the small group of veterans. Walk with me, gentlemen. We have much to discuss. Inside his office, Father Thomas finally opened the locked cabinet, removing both the leather case and the silver medallion. The veterans watched in silence as he unzipped the case, revealing the contents, not weapons but maps, tactical plans, and a small notebook filled with calculations and observations. I've been watching them, he explained, spreading the materials across his desk, mapping their movements, noting their patterns. Old habits die hard. His fingers traced lines across the town map, indicating patrol routes and gathering points. Peterson leaned forward, his military training evident in the way he analyzed the information. You've been planning for this. I've been praying it wouldn't be necessary, Father Thomas corrected. But yes, I've been planning. When you've spent as much time as I have observing human nature through a scope, you learn to read the signs. The room fell silent as the implications of his words sank in. These men, all veterans themselves, understood what he wasn't saying. That the gentle priest who had counseled them through their own wartime memories had memories of his own, darker and perhaps more haunting. The tower, one of the men said suddenly. You weren't just checking repairs up there, Father Thomas nodded. It offers excellent visibility of the entire town, multiple angles, clear lines of sight. Not that I'm planning to use that knowledge. But it's good to be prepared, Peterson finished. The question is, Father, how far are you willing to go to protect this town? Father Thomas picked up the silver medallion, running his thumb over its worn surface. I've taken lives to protect others before. I've asked God's forgiveness for each one. If it comes to that again, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I pray it doesn't, but I won't stand by and watch innocent people suffer. The veterans exchanged glances, years of shared experience, allowing them to communicate without words. Finally, Peterson spoke for the group. You're not alone in this, Father. Whatever comes next, you have support. As they discussed potential scenarios and made plans, Father Thomas felt the weight of his past and present colliding. He had chosen the path of peace, had dedicated his life to helping others find their way to God's grace. But sometimes he realized protecting that peace required skills learned in darker times. The sun was setting by the time the men left, each returning to their homes with a new sense of purpose. Father Thomas remained in his office, studying the maps and making notes. The silver medallion lay on his desk, a reminder of promises made and lives lost. Sister Margaret found him there hours later, still working by lamplight. She didn't ask about the maps or the meeting. Some questions were better left unasked. Instead, she simply placed a cup of tea on his desk and squeezed his shoulder gently. Whatever you're planning, Father, she said softly, remember that God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he sends us the right person at the right time, even if that person comes with an unexpected past. Father Thomas looked up at her, seeing the understanding in her eyes. Pray for me, sister. Pray that I find a way to protect our people without compromising everything I've become. I always do, Father, she replied. But I also pray that you remember who you are, not just the priest you became, but the man you were. Sometimes God uses all of our experiences, even the ones we'd rather forget. As she left, Father Thomas turned back to his work, but her words stayed with him. The man he had been and the priest he had become were not as separate as he had tried to make them. Perhaps it was time to accept that both parts of himself might be needed to face what was coming. The tension in Silver Valley reached a breaking point on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Father Thomas was in the middle of counseling a young couple, preparing for marriage, when the sound of breaking glass shattered the peaceful atmosphere. The noise came from the church's side chapel, where Sarah Chen had been arranging flowers for the weekend services. Father Thomas moved with unexpected speed, his measured steps carrying him to the chapel in moments. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. Two bikers stood among scattered flowers and broken vases, while Sarah pressed herself against the wall, a thin line of blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where flying glass had struck her. Just delivering a message, Father, one of the bikers sneered, kicking aside a fallen candlestick. Marcus is losing patience. Things are going to get worse unless you wise up. Father Thomas's voice, when it came, carried none of its usual warmth. Sarah, go to Sister Margaret. He didn't take his eyes off the intruders as the young woman slipped past them, her shoes crunching on broken glass. You've made a serious mistake, he continued, his tone dropping to something barely above a whisper. Entering a house of God with violence, harming an innocent person, these are not actions that will end well for you. The bikers exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for the steel in his voice. The larger of the two stepped forward, attempting to maintain their advantage. Big words from a man who's supposed to turn the other cheek. Christ taught us to turn the other cheek, Father Thomas agreed, his posture shifting subtly. But he also drove the money changers from the temple with considerable force, as I recall. Something in his stance must have registered with the bikers because they began backing toward the door. Just remember the message, Father. Next time won't be just broken glass. After they left, Father Thomas surveyed the damage to the chapel. Broken glass, scattered flowers, and a few drops of Sarah's blood on the stone floor. Each detail burned itself into his memory with the same precision he had once used to memorize target locations and wind conditions. Sister Margaret found him there, still standing among the destruction. "Sarah's with Dr. Matthews now," she reported. "The cut isn't serious, thank God. But Father—" She hesitated. "She's terrified. They all are. The Chens were already worried after what happened at their store last week, and now this—" "Father." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind working through calculations he hadn't needed to make in years. "Call Mr. Peterson," he said finally. "Tell him it's time." That evening, the church basement hosted an unusual gathering. A dozen veterans from the congregation sat around the old folding tables, joined by several business owners who had been targeted by the bikers. Father Thomas stood at the head of the table, no longer looking much like a priest, despite his collar. "They're escalating faster than we anticipated," he began, spreading out the maps he'd been updating. "The attack on Sarah changes things. They're no longer just targeting property." Peterson leaned forward, studying the marked locations. "They're getting cocky, making mistakes. That warehouse they're using as a base, only one real access road, surrounded by open ground on 3 sides. "Exactly," Father Thomas agreed. "They chose it for intimidation value, not tactical advantage. And they're not maintaining proper security. I've been watching their patterns." One of the business owners, Mike Chen from the electronics store, looked uncomfortable. "Father, are we really talking about— what exactly are you planning?" Father Thomas's expression softened slightly. "I'm planning to protect our community, Mr. Chen. Sometimes that requires using all the tools God has given us, even the ones we'd rather forget we have." He turned back to the maps, pointing out key locations. "They've established regular patrols through town, but they're predictable. Every morning between 9 and 10, they check on the businesses they're targeting. They stick to main streets, ignore the alleys." Overconfident, the veterans in the room nodded, recognizing the tactical assessment for what it was. This wasn't their gentle parish priest speaking now. This was someone else entirely. Someone who understood the mechanics of conflict on a professional level. "I've identified 3 primary observation points," Father Thomas continued, marking positions on the map. "The church tower covers most of the downtown area. The old mill provides a clear view of their warehouse, and the water tower overlooks both." Peterson's eyes narrowed. "Those are sniper positions." "They could be," Father Thomas acknowledged quietly, "though I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. For now, they're observation posts. We need to know their movements, their numbers, their habits. Knowledge is power, gentlemen." The meeting continued late into the night as they developed plans. Not for violence, not yet, but for protection. Teams were organized, communications arranged, schedules coordinated. The veterans fell easily into their old roles, while the business owners provided local knowledge and resources. When the others had gone, Peterson remained behind. "You're not just planning to observe, are you, Father?" Father Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring at the maps spread before him. "Did I ever tell you about my last mission, James? The one that led me to the priesthood?" Peterson shook, his head settling into a chair. "We were tracking a warlord in Afghanistan. He'd been terrorizing local villages, demanding protection money, killing anyone who refused to pay. Sound familiar?" Father Thomas's voice was distant, lost in memory. "I had the shot. Clean, clear, no wind. Would have ended his reign of terror with one squeeze of the trigger. But you didn't take it." "I took it," Father Thomas corrected. "But I hesitated for a fraction of a second because I saw his son running toward him. The boy couldn't have been more than 12. My hesitation meant I hit him in the chest instead of the head. He lived long enough to order his men to burn the village in revenge. 37 innocent people died because I let emotion affect my judgment. Peterson absorbed this in silence, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's why you became a priest. That's why I sought forgiveness, Father Thomas replied. But it's also why I learned that sometimes mercy to the cruel can be cruelty to the innocent. He began carefully rolling up the maps. I pray every day that we find a peaceful solution. But if they force my hand, if they threaten my people again, I won't hesitate this time. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Father Thomas completed his usual morning routine, prayers, mass, breakfast with Sister Margaret. But there was a new tension in the air. The peace he had found in his vocation still surrounded him, but it was tempered now by the weight of necessary preparation. From his office window, he watched Sarah Chen's father installing security cameras at the church. Entrance, donated by his electronics store, installed by veterans who understood strategic positioning. Similar cameras were going up all over town, their feeds monitored from a hastily assembled command center in the church basement. Sister Margaret brought him his morning coffee, studying him with concerned eyes. "I've known you for 5 years, Father," she said finally. "I thought I knew you well, but there's more to you than any of us suspected, isn't there?" Father Thomas met her gaze steadily. "We all have depths, sister. Sometimes God calls us to depths we'd rather not revisit. But he has his reasons." She nodded slowly. "Just remember who you are now, not just who you were." "That's the challenge, isn't it?" he replied softly. "Finding the balance between the man I was and the man I've become, between the skills I learned in war and the peace I found in God." As Sister Margaret left, Father Thomas opened his desk drawer and removed his old medallion. The silver surface caught the morning light, reflecting it like the scope of a rifle he hadn't touched in years. He closed his hand around it, feeling its familiar weight. The sound of motorcycles echoed from the street. Another patrol, right on schedule. Father Thomas watched them pass, his trained eye noting details automatically. Number of riders, weapons visible under jackets, patterns of movement. The skills were still there, sharp as ever, beneath his peaceful exterior. He had chosen a path of peace, had dedicated himself to God's service. But as he stood in his office, watching the bikers disappear around the corner, Father Thomas acknowledged a truth he had been avoiding. Sometimes protecting peace required more than prayers. Sometimes it required the very skills he had thought he'd left behind forever. The question was, could he find a way to use those skills without losing the peace he had found in his vocation? Could he be both the protector his people needed and the priest they depended on? Only time and Marcus's next move would tell. The inevitable escalation came sooner than anyone expected. Father Thomas was awakening for his pre-dawn prayers when the emergency alert system on his phone, newly installed as part of their security measures, buzzed urgently. The Rodriguez restaurant was on fire. Within minutes he was in his car, racing through the darkened streets of Silver Valley. The glow of flames lit up the pre-dawn sky, casting an orange pall over the neighborhood. Fire trucks were already on the scene, their lights painting the street in alternating red and white as firefighters battled the blaze. Maria Rodriguez stood on the sidewalk, clutching her children close as she watched her family's legacy burn. Little Anna's face was streaked with tears, while her brother Miguel stood rigid with shock. Their father Tony was arguing with the fire chief, his voice rising in desperation. "It was them!" he shouted. "They did this! We found the warning yesterday! Pay up or burn! And now look!" Father Thomas approached quietly, placing a steadying hand on Tony's shoulder. The restaurant owner's anger crumbled at his touch, replaced by despair. "Everything we built, Father. Everything my parents built. Before us. Gone. Not gone, Father Thomas replied, his voice firm. Damaged, yes, but not destroyed, and not forgotten. His eyes scanned the surrounding buildings, noting the positions of several motorcycles parked just beyond the emergency vehicles. Their riders stood watching the scene with poorly concealed satisfaction. As the sun rose over Silver Valley, more members of the community gathered. The Chens brought coffee and blankets for the Rodriguez family. The Hendersons offered their store's back room as temporary storage for anything that could be salvaged. Even old Mr. Peterson appeared, speaking quietly with the veterans who had positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter. Father Thomas moved among his people, offering comfort and guidance, but his mind was working on a different level. His trained eye had already spotted the signs of accelerant use, the pattern of the burn indicating a professional job. This wasn't random vandalism, it was a calculated message. Sister Margaret found him as he was examining the building's rear entrance. Father, she said quietly, Sarah Chen just called. She saw 3 bikes leaving the area just before the fire was reported. She got pictures. He nodded, unsurprised. They had prepared for this, setting up their own surveillance network throughout town. Send them to Mr. Peterson. He'll know what to do with them. As the morning progressed, more details emerged. The fire had been set at multiple points, designed to cause maximum damage while ensuring the family living above the restaurant would have time to escape. It was meant to terrorize, not kill, at least not yet. Back at the church, Father Thomas found the basement command center already active. Peterson and 2 other veterans were reviewing security footage, while Mike Chen worked on enhancing Sarah's photographs. They're getting bolder, Peterson reported, pointing to freeze frames showing the bikers without masks or any attempt at concealment. They want us to know who did it. They're not even trying to hide anymore. Father Thomas studied the images, his expression unreadable. No, they're not, because they don't think we can stop them. He turned to the maps on the wall, now marked with every incident over the past weeks. Show me their patrol pattern for this morning. As Peterson outlined the bikers' movements, a pattern emerged. They were establishing dominance, making sure everyone in town saw them, knew they could strike anywhere at any time, but in doing so, they were becoming predictable. Here, Father Thomas said, pointing to the warehouse they used as a base. Every morning between 6 and 7, they gather for shift change, all of them in one place. The implications hung heavy in the air. The veterans exchanged glances, recognizing the tactical assessment for what it was. This wasn't their gentle parish priest speaking now. This was someone else entirely. Father, Peterson began carefully, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing, Father Thomas replied, his voice level. I'm merely pointing out a tactical vulnerability, one that a trained observer might find interesting. He moved to the window, watching as more community members arrived at the church, seeking comfort and guidance in the wake of the restaurant fire. The morning sun caught the silver cross at his throat, a reminder of his vows and calling. We've tried peace, he continued quietly. We've tried reasoning with them. We've tried working through proper channels. And now an innocent family has lost everything they've built. His hands, clasped behind his back, tightened imperceptibly. There comes a point where turning the other cheek becomes complicity in evil. The basement room fell silent as the others absorbed his words. They had all seen this side of him emerging over the past weeks, but this was different. This was the final barrier between the priest they knew and the man he had been beginning to crumble. What do you need from us? Peterson asked finally. Father Thomas turned back to the group, his expression resolute. Continue monitoring their movements. I need to know exactly how many men they have, their routines, their weaknesses, and I need access to the water tower. The old veteran's eyes widened slightly. The water tower? That's over 1,500 yards from their warehouse. 1,512 yards to their front entrance, Father Thomas corrected quietly. With a clear line of sight and minimal wind interference in the early morning hours. The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. They had all heard rumors about Father Thomas's past, but this was the first time he had revealed exactly what kind of shooter he had been. "I'll make the arrangements," Peterson said finally. "But Father, are you sure about this? It's been a long time." Father Thomas's hand went to the silver medallion he now wore under his collar. "Some skills you never forget, James, even when you wish you could." As the others left to begin their tasks, Father Thomas remained in the basement, studying the maps and photographs. His mind was already making calculations, distance, wind speed, humidity factors. The same calculations that had once made him the most lethal sniper in his unit. Sister Margaret found him there hours later, still working. She took in the tactical displays, the surveillance photos, the precision measurements, and sighed softly. "I thought I'd find you here." "The Rodriguez family needs help rebuilding," he said without looking up. "We'll need to organize community support, set up a fundraising campaign." "That's not what you're planning right now, is it?" she interrupted gently. Father Thomas finally looked up, meeting her concerned gaze. "No, sister, it's not. Sometimes a shepherd must do more than comfort his flock. Sometimes he must confront the wolves directly." Sister Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a small, worn rosary. "This was my brother's," she said, placing it on the table. "He carried it through 2 tours in Desert Storm, said it helped him remember who he was, even when he had to do things he wasn't proud of." Father Thomas picked up the rosary, feeling the smooth beads under his fingers. "I'm not proud of what I'm considering, sister, but I'll be less proud if I stand by and watch our people suffer. Just remember," she said softly, "whatever you do, you're still God's servant, even if your service takes an unexpected form." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The Rodriguez family will be staying in the church guest rooms tonight. Their children are frightened." Father Thomas nodded, understanding the message. The stakes were more than property now. They were about protecting the innocent, preserving not just buildings, but the sense of safety that allowed families to thrive. As evening fell over Silver Valley, Father Thomas made his way to the church tower. The town spread out below him, streets quiet, as people hurried home before dark. From this height, he could see the warehouse where the bikers gathered, its lights blazing against the growing darkness. He had chosen this life, this calling, seeking redemption for the lives. He had taken in service to his country. He had found peace in God's grace in serving others, in building rather than destroying. But now that peace was threatened, and he faced a choice that was no choice at all. The silver medallion seemed heavy against his chest as he watched a group of bikes roar down Main Street, their riders confident in their power over the town. They had no idea that they were being watched, not by a simple priest, but by someone who had once been among the deadliest men in the Marine Corps. Tomorrow, he decided, he would visit the water tower. Some skills needed to be tested before they were relied upon, and if his prayers for a peaceful resolution went unanswered, he would need every bit of his old expertise to protect his flock from the wolves at their door. The sound of the evening. Bells called him back to his duties. There were confessions to hear, souls to counsel, prayers to offer. But even as he descended the tower steps, his mind was already making calculations, preparing for what might come. He had been 2 different men in his life, the warrior and the priest. Perhaps now God required him to be both. The pre-dawn hours found Father Thomas in an unexpected place of worship. The water tower rose above Silver Valley like a steel sentinel, its height offering a commanding view of the surrounding area. He had climbed it under cover of darkness, carrying a long canvas bag that hadn't seen use in over a decade. The morning air was crisp and still, perfect conditions for what he needed to verify. As he set up his equipment with practiced precision, memories flooded back. The weight of the rifle, the familiar feel of the scope, the mechanical routine of assembly that his hands remembered even if his mind wished to forget. Through the scope, he could see the warehouse clearly. Even in the dim light, he could make out details that confirmed what their surveillance had suggested. 2 guards at the main entrance, poorly positioned. 3 bikes parked haphazardly by the side door. No proper perimeter security. "Our Father who art in heaven," he whispered, the familiar prayer mixing with the familiar act of ranging his target. "Hallowed be thy name." The sound of someone climbing the tower's ladder interrupted his devotion. He didn't need to look to know it was Peterson. No one else would have known to find him here. "Thought I might find you up here," the veteran said quietly, settling beside him. "Testing the waters?" Father Thomas made a slight adjustment to his scope, confirming calculations. "The wind at this height is different from what you'd expect. Changes everything." Peterson watched him work, noting the precision of his movements. "You haven't lost it?" "No," Father Thomas agreed softly. "That's what I was afraid of." The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Through the scope, Father Thomas could see movement at the warehouse as the bikers began their morning routine. Marcus had arrived, his distinctive bike pulling up to the main entrance. "Range is good," Father Thomas reported professionally. "Wind is negligible at this hour, multiple clear shots available." He began breaking down the rifle with the same mechanical precision he'd used to assemble it. "God help me, James, but I can do this." "Question is," Peterson replied, "will you?" Father Thomas packed away the rifle carefully before responding. "Not yet. This was just insurance, knowing I can if I have to." He turned to face his old friend. "But they need to be given one more chance to choose a different path." The day that followed was filled with the usual duties of a parish priest. But there was an underlying tension that even his most faithful parishioners could sense. Father Thomas moved through his tasks with his usual grace, but those who knew him best could see the military bearing becoming more pronounced in his posture. Late that afternoon, as he was preparing for evening mass, Sister Margaret brought him news that made his blood run cold. The Rodriguez children, Ana and Miguel, had been followed home from school by 2 bikers. Nothing had happened, yet, but the message was clear. "They were just watching," Sister Margaret reported, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "But Anna said they revved their engines every time the children crossed a street, trying to frighten them." Father Thomas's hand stilled on the altar cloth he had been arranging. "Where are they now?" "In the church hall with their mother." "Maria's afraid to take them home?" Sister Margaret watched him carefully. "Father, I've never seen you like this." Indeed, something had changed in his bearing. The gentle priest seemed to fade slightly, revealing steel underneath. "Cancel evening mass," he said quietly. "Call Mr. Peterson. Tell him it's time for—" In the meeting we discussed. As the sun set over Silver Valley, an unusual gathering took place in the church basement. The veterans were there, along with representatives from every family that had been targeted. Maps and surveillance photos covered the walls, and in the center of the table lay Father Thomas's rifle case, still closed, but its presence speaking volumes. "They're targeting children now," Father Thomas began without preamble. "Testing our resolve, seeing how much we'll tolerate before we break." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made everyone in the room sit straighter. "That ends tomorrow." He outlined his plan carefully. It wasn't just about confrontation. It was about coordination, about using the entire community's resources to protect their own. The veterans would provide security, the business owners would coordinate communications, and every family would know exactly what to do when the time came. "But what about the police?" someone asked. "Surely they can't just ignore this forever." "The police chief's brother-in-law was seen meeting with Marcus last week," Peterson replied grimly. "We're on our own." Father Thomas moved to the maps, pointing out key locations. "Tomorrow morning they'll gather at the warehouse for their usual meeting. They think they know this town's rhythms, think they can predict how we'll react." His finger traced a line, from the water tower to the warehouse. "They're wrong." The meeting continued late into the night, each person's role carefully defined. When the others had gone, Peterson remained behind with Father Thomas. "You know they might force your hand," the veteran said quietly. "If they realize what's happening, they might not give you a choice." Father Thomas was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the outline of his rifle case. "I've made my peace with that possibility. What concerns me more is what comes after. How do I continue as their priest if I have to, if it comes to that?" Peterson considered this. "Maybe that's exactly why it has to be you, because you understand the weight of it, because you'll carry that burden with the gravity it deserves." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Father Thomas completed his morning prayers with particular attention, asking for guidance, for wisdom, and, if necessary, for steady hands. The silver medallion hung heavy against his chest as he made his final preparations. Sister Margaret found him in his office, wearing his usual black clothing but with subtle differences. Clothes selected for freedom of movement, boots chosen for silent traction. The gentle priest was still there in his bearing, but now she could clearly see the warrior beneath. "The Rodriguez family is safe in the basement," she reported. "All the other families are in position. Whatever happens." She hesitated, then reached out to straighten his collar. "God be with you, Father." Father Thomas checked his watch. 30 minutes until the bikers' morning meeting. Everything was in place. The veterans had taken up their positions around town. Communications were established, and escape routes were prepared for every family if things went wrong. He took one last look around his office, at the books he had studied, the desk where he had counseled troubled souls, the window through which he had watched his town suffer. Then he picked up his rifle case and headed for the door. "Father," Sister Margaret called after him. He turned to find her holding out her brother's rosary. "Remember who you are, all of who you are." He accepted the rosary, tucking it into his pocket next to the medallion. Then he stepped out into the morning light, ready to be both shepherd and warrior, priest and protector. The time for turning the other cheek had passed. Now was the time for driving the money changers from the temple, by whatever means necessary. The water tower awaited, its height offering both sanctuary and purpose. As Father Thomas began his climb, the weight of his rifle case balanced by the weight of his calling, he whispered a final prayer, not for forgiveness this time, but for accuracy, if it proved necessary. God's mercy was infinite, he knew, but sometimes that mercy had to be delivered from 1,500 yards away, through the scope of a rifle, in defense of those who could not defend themselves. The days following the bikers' departure brought a gradual return to normalcy in Silver Valley, though subtle changes lingered in the air like incense after Mass. Father Thomas resumed his daily routines, morning prayers, counseling sessions, community outreach, but there was a new dimension to how his parishioners viewed him. Respect mingled with something deeper, an understanding that their gentle priest was also their fierce protector. The Rodriguez family reopened their restaurant with overwhelming community support. The reopening dinner became an impromptu celebration of the town's resilience, with Father Thomas saying grace before a packed house. As he blessed the gathering, he noticed how the veterans had positioned themselves around the room. Old habits, dying hard even in times of peace, "You've changed this town, Father," Maria Rodriguez told him as she served him a plate of her famous enchiladas, "not just by what you did, but by showing us we could stand together." Father Thomas smiled gently, though his eyes remained watchful even now. "The strength was always here, Mrs. Rodriguez. Sometimes we just need a reminder of what we're capable of when we unite in purpose." Later that evening, as he walked back to the church, he noticed other changes in Silver Valley. Neighbors chatted. On porches late into the evening, children played in front yards without fearful parents hovering nearby, and the general atmosphere of fear had been replaced by one of quiet confidence. Sister Margaret was waiting in his office, a stack of papers. On his desk, "The donations for the security camera system have exceeded expectations," she reported, "and Mr. Chen has volunteers lined up for monitoring shifts through the next 3 months. "Good," Father Thomas nodded. "We should maintain awareness. Freedom requires vigilance." "Speaking of vigilance," Sister Margaret hesitated, then placed a newspaper on his desk. The headline read, "Mysterious Exodus. Biker Gang Abandons Territory. Claims in Silver Valley." Father Thomas scanned the article briefly. It painted a picture of confusion, law enforcement baffled by the gang's sudden departure, speculation about internal power struggles, no mention of a priest with a particular set of skills. "They're already becoming a memory," Sister Margaret observed. "But we won't forget, will we?" "No," Father Thomas agreed quietly. "We'll remember the lesson, if not the teachers." His hand unconsciously touched the silver medallion beneath his collar. "How are the children doing?" Ana Rodriguez asked about you in Sunday school. She wanted to know if angels could shoot rifles. Sister Margaret's eyes twinkled slightly. "I told her to ask her parents." Father Thomas couldn't help but smile, though it was tinged with sadness. He had hoped to keep his past separate from his ministry, but perhaps this merging of identities served a purpose he hadn't anticipated. His congregation now understood that faith and strength weren't mutually exclusive. That night, as he prepared for evening prayers, Mr. Peterson appeared in the church doorway. The old veteran carried himself differently now, with renewed purpose. "Got a minute, Father?" They sat in the front pew, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows. "The word spreading," Peterson said without preamble. "About what happened here. Other towns are asking questions, wanting to know how we handled it." Father Thomas was silent for a moment, considering the implications. "We must be careful with that narrative, James. This isn't about violence or revenge. It's about community, about protecting what matters." "That's just it," Peterson leaned forward earnestly. "These other towns, they're not asking about tactics. They're asking about how we brought people together, how we organized. The shooting part never happened as far as anyone knows." The priest nodded slowly. "Perhaps that's the real miracle here. Not that we defeated our enemies, but that we found our collective strength." As if to emphasize his point, the church doors opened to admit several parishioners arriving for evening prayers. Among them was Sarah Chen, her face no longer showing, the fear that had haunted her since the attack. She carried fresh flowers for the altar, her movements confident and purposeful. The evening prayer service was fuller than usual, a trend that had continued since the bikers' departure. Father Thomas had noticed that people lingered longer after services, talking with neighbors, making plans, strengthening the bonds of community that had proven so crucial. Later, in his office, Father Thomas reviewed the security reports that had become part of his daily routine. The town's new surveillance system showed nothing unusual, just the peaceful activities of a community going about its business. His rifle case remained locked in its cabinet, a last resort he prayed would never be needed again. A soft knock at his door revealed Mike Chen, tablet in hand. "The last of the security cameras are installed, Father. We've got coverage of every major intersection and approach to town." He paused, then added, "It's not just about security anymore. People feel like they're part of something bigger." Father Thomas understood what he meant. The camera network had become a symbol of the town's unity, a reminder that they were all watching out for each other. "How's Sarah doing?" "Better," Chen smiled. "She's organizing a youth group at the church, if that's okay. Says she wants to help other kids feel as safe as she does now." The priest felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening's humidity. "Tell her she has my full support. The church should be a place of growth, not just shelter." As Chen left, Father Thomas found himself reflecting on the transformations he had witnessed. The town had changed, yes, but so had he. The careful separation he had maintained between his past and present had crumbled, replaced by a new integration of all that he was: warrior and priest, protector and shepherd. Sister Margaret's evening. Round found him still at his desk, writing his Sunday sermon. "Still up, Father?" "Just finishing," he replied, gesturing to his notes. "I've been thinking about David and Goliath." "Appropriate," she nodded. "Though in our case, Goliath chose to leave rather than face the stone. Sometimes the willingness to act is as powerful as the action itself." Father Thomas set down his pen. "The town is healing, sister, not just from recent events, but from the fear that allowed those events to happen." Sister Margaret settled into the chair across from him. "And what about you, Father? Are you healing too?" The question gave him pause. "I'm integrating," he said finally. "For years I tried to keep my past separate from my calling. Now I understand that God can use all parts of us in His service." "Even the parts we'd rather forget?" "Especially those," he nodded. "The skills I learned as a warrior helped protect this community. The discipline I learned as a priest helped control those skills. Both were necessary." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of motorcycles passing on the main road. Ordinary riders this time, just passing through. Father Thomas noticed that while he registered the sound, his hands didn't tense as they once had. Progress of a sort. The next morning brought another change to Silver Valley. The town council, led by several business owners who had been targeted by the bikers, proposed establishing a permanent community watch program. Father Thomas was asked to advise, drawing on both his military experience and his role as a spiritual leader. "We need to maintain our readiness without becoming paranoid," he explained at the meeting. "This isn't about looking for threats around every corner. It's about staying connected, watching out for each other." The program took shape under his guidance, organized but not militant, vigilant but not fearful. The veterans provided training in observation and reporting, while church groups coordinated communication networks. It was a balance of security and community that reflected Father Thomas's own journey. As he walked home that evening, he passed the Rodriguez restaurant again. The rebuilt storefront gleamed in the setting sun, and through the windows he could see families gathered for dinner. Children played in the parking lot where bikers had once prowled, their laughter a testament to restored innocence. The silver medallion rested against his chest, no longer a hidden reminder of his past, but an integrated part of his present. The warrior and the priest had found their balance, each informing and tempering the other. His rifle remained locked away, but its presence was no longer a source of conflict. It was simply another tool in service of his calling. Back in his office, Father Thomas found a small package on his desk. Inside was a framed photograph of the town taken from the church tower, with a note from Sarah Chen. "Thank you for showing us how to be strong without losing our humanity." He placed the photo on his wall, next to his ordination certificate. Both represented fundamental truths about who he was and what he could offer his community. The evening bells began to ring, calling him to his duties, and Father Thomas rose with the peaceful certainty of a man who had finally reconciled all aspects of his nature. The sun set over Silver Valley, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. From his window, Father Thomas could see his parishioners going about their evening routines, free from fear, strong in their unity. He offered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for the peace that had been restored, but for the understanding that sometimes maintaining peace required all of one's skills, all of one's history, all of one's being. The autumn morning arrived in Silver Valley with a crispness that spoke of changing seasons. Father Thomas stood at the church entrance, greeting his parishioners as they arrived for Sunday service. The congregation had grown in recent months, drawn not just by his sermons, but by the sense of community that had strengthened in the wake of their shared trials. Today's sermon would be different. After much prayer and contemplation, Father Thomas had decided it was time to address what had happened, to help his flock understand the deeper meanings behind their recent struggles. The silver medallion beneath his collar seemed to warm against his skin, as if acknowledging the importance of this moment. As the church filled, he noticed familiar faces. The Rodriguez family in their usual pew, Sarah Chen with her parents, Mr. Peterson and his fellow veterans scattered strategically throughout the congregation. The habits of vigilance remained, though tempered now by peace rather than fear. Sister Margaret caught his eye as she finished lighting the altar candles, giving him an encouraging nod. She, more than anyone, understood the significance of what he was about to share. Today, Father Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, I want to speak about transformation, about how God can use all of our experiences, even those we might wish to forget, in service of His purpose. He paused, his eyes meeting those of his parishioners. Many of you have asked about my past, about the skills that helped protect our community. Some of you have wondered how a priest could possess such abilities, how the warrior and the shepherd could exist in one soul. The silence in the church was absolute as he continued. Before I was called to God's service, I served our country as a Marine Corps sniper. I took lives in defense of others, carried burdens that weighed heavily on my soul. When I left that life behind, I thought I needed to bury those experiences, to become someone entirely new. Father Thomas touched his collar where the silver medallion lay hidden. But God in His wisdom showed me that we are not meant to fragment ourselves. Every experience, every skill, every burden we carry can be transformed in service of His purpose. He spoke of his struggles to reconcile his past with his calling, of the moment he realized that protecting his flock might require all of who he was. As he shared his journey, he could see understanding dawning in the faces before him. When those who threatened our peace arrived, he continued, I fought an internal battle as fierce as any external conflict. Could I be both the priest you needed and the protector you deserved? Would using my military skills compromise my spiritual calling? The Rodriguez children leaned forward in their pew, hanging on every word. Their parents held hands tightly, remembering the fear they had lived with and the peace that had been restored. What I learned, what God showed me through these events, was that we are all called to use every gift we possess in service of what is right. Sometimes those gifts come from unexpected places, wrapped in experiences we might wish to forget. Sarah Chen wiped tears from her eyes as Father Thomas spoke of transformation, of finding strength in unity, of turning past pain into present purpose. Her father squeezed her shoulder, both of them remembering the day she had been threatened in the church garden. The miracle that occurred in Silver Valley wasn't just the departure of those who wished us harm, Father Thomas continued. The true miracle was the transformation of our community. We discovered that strength doesn't require violence, that protection can come through presence rather than force, that the mere willingness to act can often prevent the need for action. He spoke of the security cameras that now watched over their streets, not as tools of fear, but as symbols of community vigilance. He mentioned the volunteer groups that had formed, the networks of support that had grown stronger with each passing. "Weak, we are called to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves," he quoted. "This doesn't mean dividing ourselves into separate aspects, the wise warrior and the innocent priest. It means integrating all that we are in service of what is right and good." As he concluded his sermon, Father Thomas could feel a shift in the atmosphere of the church. His openness about his past, about his struggles to reconcile his different roles, had touched something deep in his congregation. They understood now that their priest's strength came not just from his faith or his military background, but from his willingness to be fully who God had made him to be. After the service, people lingered longer than usual, speaking in hushed tones about what they had heard. Mr. Peterson approached the altar where Father Thomas was preparing for the next service. "That couldn't have been easy," the veteran said quietly. "Sharing all that." Father Thomas nodded. It was necessary. They needed to understand that strength and faith aren't opposing forces, that God can use all of our experiences, even the difficult ones. The younger veterans especially needed to hear that, Peterson observed. Some of them have been struggling with their own past experiences, feeling like they had to choose between who they were and who they want to be. Throughout the day, others approached him with similar responses. A young Marine home on leave told him how the sermon had helped him understand his own struggles. Sarah Chen's father spoke of finding new purpose in using his technical skills to protect the community. That evening, as Father Thomas prepared for night prayers, Sister Margaret brought him a stack of notes that had been left in the collection plate, messages of gratitude, understanding, and support from his congregation. "You've given them something precious today," she said, placing the notes on his desk. "Not just the truth about your past, but permission to integrate their own struggles into their faith." Father Thomas picked up one of the notes, reading the carefully written words of a mother whose son was serving overseas. "I've been praying for someone who could understand both my faith and my fear," she had written. "Today I realized he's been here all along." The silver medallion seemed lighter against his chest now, as if sharing his story had lifted some of its weight. His rifle remained locked away, but its presence was no longer a source of conflict. It was simply another tool, another aspect of who he was and what he could offer in service of his calling. As night fell over Silver Valley, Father Thomas stood in the church tower, his customary evening vigil taking on new meaning. The town spread out below him, peaceful under the stars, protected not just by his skills or his faith, but by the strength of a community that had learned to stand together. He could see the lights of the Rodriguez restaurant, still open late, serving families who no longer hurried home at sunset, the Chen's electronics store, its new security cameras keeping watch, the Veterans Center, where former soldiers gathered to share their stories and find new purpose in protecting their community. The evening breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke, and Father Thomas offered a prayer of gratitude, not just for the peace that had been restored to Silver Valley, but for the deeper peace he had found within himself. The warrior and the priest had become one, each aspect strengthening the other, all in service of his true calling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve both God and community. But now he could face them as a whole person, no longer divided between past and present, between strength and compassion. His congregation understood, his community was stronger, and his path forward was clear. The silver medallion and the priest's collar were no longer symbols of different lives, but reminders of the complete person God had shaped him to be. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest transformation of all. The winter morning dawned cold and clear over Silver Valley, frost glittering on the church windows like scattered diamonds. Father Thomas stood at the altar, preparing for morning Mass, when Sister Margaret hurried in with news that would test everything the community had built. "Father," she said, her breath coming quickly. "Marcus has been spotted in Carson City, just 50 miles away. Mr. Chen's security network picked up the information. He's gathering new followers, and there are rumors." Father Thomas continued his preparations, his movements deliberate and calm. "What kind of rumors, sister?" "They say he's planning something, that he can't let go of what happened here, that his reputation—" She hesitated. "They say he's telling. People a priest made him look weak, and he needs to fix that." The silver medallion felt heavy against Father Thomas's chest as he absorbed this information. The peace they had found in Silver Valley suddenly seemed more precious, more fragile. But he had learned that true strength came from being prepared, not from being afraid. "Have you told the others?" he asked, referring to the network of veterans and community leaders they had maintained. "Mr. Peterson is already organizing a meeting." The Rodriguez family heard rumors too, through their restaurant suppliers. "People are worried, Father." Father Thomas straightened the altar cloth with precise movements. "Then we'll need to remind them that worry isn't the same as fear, that preparation isn't the same as paranoia." He turned to face Sister Margaret. "Call the meeting for after morning mass. We'll handle this together as a community." The church filled slowly that morning, the congregation subdued as word spread through the town. Father Thomas could see the concern in their faces, the way parents held their children closer. The subtle positioning of the veterans near the doors, old habits resurging in response to potential threats. His sermon that morning focused on perseverance, on the strength found in unity, on the difference between peaceful resolution and passive acceptance of evil. As he spoke, he could see determination replacing fear in the eyes of his flock. After the service, the meeting in the church basement drew more people than expected. Mr. Peterson and his fellow veterans took their usual positions, but now they were joined by business owners, parents, and other community members who had learned the value of preparedness. "What we built here," Father Thomas began, addressing the gathered crowd, "wasn't just about driving away a specific threat. It was about creating a community that could stand together against any challenge. We're about to be tested on that." Mike Chen brought up the security footage on a large screen, showing Marcus and his new followers in Carson City. "They're different from before," he reported. "More organized, more disciplined. They're learning from their mistakes." "So must we," Father Thomas replied. He moved to the maps still mounted on the walls, now updated with new security camera positions and community watch points. "We have advantages we didn't have before. We have preparation, organization, and most importantly, unity." The meeting continued for hours, plans being made, responsibilities assigned. The veterans would increase their patrols. The business owners would enhance their security measures. The families would look out for each other, maintaining the network of communication they had developed. As the others filed out, Mr. Peterson remained behind with Father Thomas. "It's different this time," the old veteran observed. "They'll be expecting your skills, planning for them." "Yes," Father Thomas agreed quietly, "which is why we need to be smarter, not just stronger. Marcus is expecting the warrior he glimpsed before. He needs to understand that he's facing an entire community. Over the next few days, Silver Valley, transformed again, but differently than before. There was no panic, no desperate scrambling for protection. Instead, there was purpose, organization, the calm efficiency of people who had learned from experience. Father Thomas maintained his usual routines, morning prayers, counseling sessions, community service, but with subtle adjustments. His trips to the church tower became more frequent, his observations more detailed. The rifle case in his office was cleaned and checked, but not with desperate urgency. This was preparation, not fear. Sarah Chen, who had once been terrorized in the church garden, now led a youth group that combined community service with awareness training. The Rodriguez children, no longer frightened by the memory of being followed home, helped organize a neighborhood watch program among their friends. "They're not just getting stronger," Sister Margaret observed one evening, watching the youth group practice their observation and reporting skills. "They're getting wiser." Father Thomas nodded, his hand unconsciously touching the silver medallion. "That's the real victory we need to protect, not just our safety, but our growth. Our understanding that strength comes in many forms." The warning came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by one of Peterson's contacts in Carson City. Marcus was on the move, with a force nearly twice the size of his previous group. They were better armed, better organized, and fueled by their leader's need for revenge. Father Thomas received the news in his office, the morning sun casting long shadows across his desk. The rifle case sat in its cabinet, still locked away, but now representing something different. Not just a last resort, but a reminder that preparation took many forms. "They'll come at night," Peterson predicted during their strategy meeting. "Try to catch us sleeping, use their numbers to overwhelm our defenses." "Then we'll be ready before night falls," Father Thomas replied. He turned to the gathered community. "Leaders, this isn't just about defending against an attack. It's about showing them that Silver Valley isn't just protected by one person with a rifle. It's protected by all of us, each in our own way." The plan they developed was comprehensive, drawing on every resource the community had built. The security camera network was enhanced with new sensors. Communication systems were tested and refined. Escape routes were established for every family, though few intended to use them. As darkness approached, Father Thomas made his way to the church tower for his evening vigil. The town spread out below him, but it was different now. Lights burned in windows that would normally be dark. Shadows moved purposefully through the streets. Veterans on patrol, community members checking on neighbors, young people running. Messages between groups. The silver medallion and the rosary beads clinked softly together as he raised his binoculars, scanning the approaches to town. His rifle lay ready beside him, but it wasn't his only tool anymore. Through his earpiece, he could hear the quiet communications of his community preparing for what might come. "Father," Sister Margaret's voice came through his radio. "The Rodriguez family just reported motorcycle sounds from the North Highway, multiple engines getting closer." "Understood," he replied calmly. "All units, maintain positions. Remember your training. We're not just defending buildings, we're defending everything we've built together." The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, but Silver Valley was ready. Not with weapons or violence, but with unity, organization, and the quiet strength of a community that had learned to stand together. Father Thomas watched through his scope as the first bikes appeared on the horizon, his finger steady on the trigger, but his heart steady in faith. The true test of Silver Valley was about to begin, not just of its defenses, but of its transformation from a collection of individuals into a true community. The warrior priest in the tower was no longer their only protection. He was simply one part of something much stronger, much more lasting than any single person could be. As the first stars appeared above Silver Valley, Father Thomas offered a quiet prayer, not for accuracy this time, but for wisdom, for the strength to protect his flock in whatever way proved necessary, and for the grace to do so without losing the peace they had all worked so hard to build. The confrontation that night became a legend in Silver Valley, but not for the reasons Marcus had hoped. When his gang roared into town, they found not a vulnerable target, but a community united and prepared. Every street was lit, every approach monitored, and every family protected not just by Father Thomas's watchful eye from the tower, but by their neighbors' unwavering solidarity. Marcus found himself facing not just a skilled sniper, but an entire town that refused to be intimidated. The red dot of Father Thomas's scope on his chest served only to emphasize a deeper truth he had already lost, not to superior firepower, but to superior spirit. No shots were fired that night. They weren't necessary. The sight of citizens standing calmly in their doorways, veterans positioned at strategic points, and the quiet confidence of a community that had learned to protect itself proved more powerful than any display of force. Father Thomas's voice, carried over a loudspeaker from the church tower, delivered the final message: "Your choices haven't changed, Marcus. Only the consequences have grown. This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about them. All of them. Look around you." Marcus did look, and what he saw broke his remaining resolve. This wasn't the same town he had tried to intimidate months ago. This was something else entirely. A community transformed by adversity into something unshakable. The gang departed as they had come, with the roar of motorcycles fading into the night. But this time they left not just Silver Valley behind, but any thought of returning. Father Thomas descended from the tower that night, both warrior and priest, but more importantly, just one part of a community that had learned to be its own. Guardian! The silver medallion rested lighter against his chest, its burden now shared by an entire town that had found its strength.